Welcome, everyone, to get back to our podcast, Gender Sandwich. We are your hosts. My name is Ray. I use they, them pronouns.
And I am Ryan. I use he and they pronouns.
My name's Shelby. I use they, them pronouns.
Fantastic. I know today we are talking about some queer trans 101, as answering some basic questions on phrases and terms, concepts, and we might even be able to get into some flag history. Though depending on how long everything else takes, we may save that for another episode.
We are really excited to be able to cover some of the history of the community and talk about our experiences and what some of these terms and the language mean to us and some of the other community members that we know and work with.
I'm really excited to cover these because a lot of these are basic questions that I find myself answering a lot from just whether it be friends, family, or just like random people on the street or on the internet who just really don't know how to they're really just curious, and it's hard to find when you're faced with something new like this. It's hard to know whether or not you're being insensitive or rude when you ask these questions. And there are some people who don't want to be your educational resource, and that's their right. But that doesn't mean the questions shouldn't be answered. And so I'm really happy to provide a resource where people can find those answers without having to worry about whether or not they're putting undue burden on someone.
Absolutely. And I would like to just put out there for any of our listeners who are tuning in, if you are interested in having your questions answered and you don't have someone that you feel that you can go to, please send us an email at gendersandwichpod@gmail.com. We'd be happy to review your questions and provide information as we can. And it may even end up in the podcast if you're interested in having your topic covered.
Definitely, definitely. A lot of the questions we're going to cover today are things that we just requested on social media that people sent in, and also just questions that we know we run into often. So please feel free to send in any questions or topics that you would like covered.
Yeah. I am really excited to go over some of the basics of this
Hmm.
as well. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is just talking about what being gender nonconforming, non-binary, or transgender means to the community, because everyone has their own experience. Even though
Hmm.
Ray and Ryan and I all identify as non-binary, we have very different experiences, very different gender presentations. And this is one of my favorite parts about talking about gender, is that there is not a wrong way to express your gender. It is completely individual. And I just love that the community is becoming more expansive and inclusive. And I'm really
Hmm.
excited to talk a little bit more about that with everybody.
Definitely. I always talk to people about how there's the old concept that that we find ourselves teaching a lot, that gender presentation does not equal gender identity. It does not equal sexual orientation, and definitely does not equal sex, which are all separate things. And we can go into what all of those, and we're going to go into what all of those separate things mean. But there is this habit that people have, that all human brains have, to assume because of a presentation something else means. Um, so it means something else. Like, because they see one presentation, it obviously means this other thing. One of my favorite pieces of advice that my therapist ever gave me was, there are two things that our brain likes to do. Our brain is good at two things, and that is finding patterns and lying to us. And they go hand in hand because when our brain is literally programmed to find patterns and then keep things within those patterns, and it will lie to us to keep those patterns alive. So if you don't do the work to separate presentation from, like, gender presentation, or aesthetic from gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex, if you don't do that inner work, then your brain is just going to keep making those assumptions because that's what it's programmed to do. Which is why that, if you find yourself making assumptions based on presentation, know that it's, something that all humans do, and it is something that everyone has to work on.
Absolutely. It is definitely a learning process to
Hmm.
remove people from a binary that we are placed on in society. And what I mean by that, for anyone who's not familiar with the term gender binary, because of the way that society typically views gender in one side of the coin or the other, that is referred to as the binary. And it's really challenging to kind of break away from that and help people understand that that binary exists because we decided that it did. Gender presentation is not something that we as humans developed outside of our own species. It's not something that we developed alongside of our hair and our fingers. It's something that we invented along with time and other concepts that I won't get into right now, but it's really interesting to talk about gender from that perspective because a lot of people see it as the norm, and it's true, it is the norm, but it's the norm because we've decided that it is. And there's a lot of cultures historically that see gender outside of that binary, and that's why I love being able to talk about it. And we are hoping to have guests from some of those other communities come on. I'm not going to discuss them myself because I don't represent those communities and I don't want to perpetuate that type of interaction, but I am really excited to be able to explore this more and share this information with everybody.
I will put this out there because I know we did get a question about, cultures, like indigenous cultures in like the Celtic and the Nordic regions and their concepts of gender and that idea. And I know that we've been, that those cultures have been taken away from their indigenous roots. They were originally indigenous cultures that were then colonized and, between the colonization, the genocide, and forcing people to give up their religion and their culture to conform into one idea, one like monolith, was the hope. We lost a lot of that language, but I will put this out there that as a person who has Nordic and Irish and Celtic background, my indigenous roots were also that they didn't have this strict adherence to the gender binary. And to the heteronormative cis normative culture. Like that wasn't the indigenous cultures. So there are still cultures active today that have that separate, that don't have that heteronormative, cisnormative idea in society. And like Shelby said, I'm not going to try to overstep my bounds and speak to those too much, but I would love to have guests in the future. But I also want to put that out there that even if you aren't a part of those communities, look into your history, look into your indigenous roots, because all of us were indigenous to one area at one point in our history and our ancestry, and you'll find that a lot of that culture, that diversity was lost a lot with the Romans, with many other colonizing cultures. And so it's one of my favorite things about being non-binary is that it has allowed me to reconnect with roots that were lost through colonization hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago.
I agree, right? And I think it's really interesting to look at it from that perspective because it is true. Colonization is a large part of the reason why so much of this culture has been lost. And I do think that gender culture, as we're talking about it from this perspective outside of the currently accepted quote normal binary, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that colonization has impacted cultures across the world, and there are many indigenous populations that were affected, and it's really important to be aware of the racial indication of that. But even cultures like Ray was saying in the Nordic and the Celtic regions, there was a lot of culture and a lot of religious practices that were lost to colonization. And it's really interesting to kind of dig back and find evidence that these are things that were widely accepted prior to that colonization and just the widespread Roman Christianity movement that happened. I don't want to make this about religion, but unfortunately it does tie into colonization. It's hard not to discuss them in the same topic. But yeah,
Okay.
it is really interesting. One thing that I did want to start off with this conversation, I came across a thought exercise that I thought would be a really good way to kind of jump into thinking about gender and what that means. So, it can be difficult for people that are not transgender or non-binary to imagine what that feels like. But if you can just imagine for a moment that you wake up one day and you believe that everyone around you believes that you're a different gender than you are. They see you as a man, they expect you to act like a man, but you're not. You don't feel like it. You're a woman. You believe you're a woman your whole life, but everybody sees you in a different way. How would that make you feel? It's really interesting to see it from that perspective, because for me, I didn't realize that I was transgender until a year ago. And to look back at the experiences that I had as a child, it's very apparent that I was struggling with my gender identity, but I didn't understand it from that perspective because I just wanted to be seen as quote normal. So it's really interesting to just stop and take a moment to really think about what it would feel like to exist in a body that nobody else sees the way that you feel. And that's
Mhm.
a lot of the experiences that I have had as a transgender person. And looking back, I experienced my whole life. I just didn't have words to explain or describe why I didn't want to wear dresses or play with dolls.
It's one of those things, this idea of how do you know you're transgender? How do you know you're not transgender? And my favorite response to that question is, how do you know that you're cis? I've noticed that a lot of things that come with being cisgender or even heterosexual or allosexual or whatever it is, if you are the quote unquote norm, you have the privilege, the freedom of not thinking about it, if that makes sense. I know a lot of heterosexual people who I've spoken to them and they've never had to think about their sexual orientation because what people assumed was true. And so they never felt a disconnect, a dissonance with themselves and the world around them. Um, and so something that I've found in my life is that I have always had to think about my sexual orientation. I've always had to think about my romantic orientation. I've always had to think about um, whether I'm ace or allo. Like I've always had to think about my gender identity, even before I knew what that meant. It was always present in my mind because what people were saying about me and to me didn't fit. It was a disconnect. Like I felt like they were missing the target, like I was being forced into a box that wasn't right. And I
Yes.
didn't know what was happening until I actually had the opportunity to sit down and think about it, um, with the freedom of knowing that I had options. Because even if it was always present in my mind, I didn't know that it was an option to be not straight, to be not cis, all of that. And so once I was presented with the option, I knew the answer. And so it's not true for everybody. Like there's always a journey that everyone has to go on. But I've found that I think the biggest way to, like, if you're trying to empathize with people who are a different, who are not the quote unquote normal, who are not the quote unquote factory settings as you were, um, whatever you want to call it, who are not what is accepted by society, imagine having your sexuality, your gender identity, color every single interaction, and not because you want it to, but because it has to be present in your mind because you don't fit. You feel like you end up feeling like a puzzle piece trying to be shoved into place that it doesn't work, right? Like someone just wants you to fit into this one place in the puzzle, but that's not your place. You
It's
need to
very
go to,
true.
you need to find your own place.
Now, one thing that I would like to call out, Ray had used a term that I'm not sure if we've covered on the podcast up to this
Hmm.
point. Ray, you had said the term allosexual. So I just want to clarify
Hmm.
that allosexual and asexual, these are terms that specifically relate to sexual attraction to other people. Allosexual means that you do experience sexual attraction to others. Asexual means that your sexual attraction may come and go. You may not have it. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of what
Hmm.
that term means.
Hmm. I'm glad you brought that up. That is one thing. When you're outside of the community, it's sometimes hard to realize exactly how much diversity and how much difference there is within the community, and that you can be a part of the queer community because your sexual orientation, your romantic orientation, your whether you're allo, ace, or demi, like allosexual, asexual, demisexual, or whether you're trans or non-binary, gender non-conforming. Like there's so many things that go into it, and so that's why we end up having what is referred to as micro labels, like labels within general overarching identities. Like you have an umbrella term, and then within that you have micro terms, so that people can better describe their own personal experience and how they move through the world and how they experience the world. So if you ever get lost with labels, with like you're like, oh wow, there's so many labels, what am I doing? How am I supposed to know what they all mean? You can ask the person, you can Google them. No, like you can't know everything, and you can't know what you don't have access to the knowledge. Like if you've never been confronted with that, you can't know it. So never be afraid to Google something or ask someone if they're comfortable sharing what that means to them. That is a phrasing that I really appreciate. And I think I haven't found someone who disagrees with that phrasing, where you'll be like, hey, would you mind sharing what that label means to you?
Yeah, and I
Because
think that it's, oh, I'm sorry, Ray, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, because it can mean something different for different people, and it's a really good way to get closer and get to know people on a more like on a closer level.
Definitely. And one thing that I would like to interject here that I think is really important to remember because of the social climate that we live in, there unfortunately is a lot of backlash to the LGBTQ community in general and some of these very diverse identities that are coming out. There's a lot of pushback, and I think that it's just important to state that these terms and identities and people are all fluid. People can change their identities at any time. New terms are constantly coming up as people start to better understand their identities and where they fit into the spectrum of sexuality and gender and attraction. These are all very complicated ideas, and it's not as black and white as straight or gay, romantic or not. There's so many things in between, and you do not have to know or memorize every single term in the community to be an ally, to be a supportive member of the community. But the important part is to remain willing to learn. It's just like anything else. We have to be willing to meet people where they're at and be curious and ask questions in a respectful way. And there is not a single person that I have met professionally or personally that is not willing to have a respectful conversation about things that you're curious about. Of course, there's always going to be topics that are not appropriate to bring up with someone, so make sure that you understand your audience a little bit, but it really is important to just stay curious and respectful. And I think that those conversations are a lot easier if you approach them that way. And you don't have to
Hmm.
know everything. It's not required to be a respectful and a helpful ally.
No, yeah, you can't be. No one expects you to know everything because no one knows everything. That's part of the whole thing about it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, one of the questions that I was really curious about your input on, Ray, what does it mean to you to be transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming? I know we've talked a little bit about kind of knowing when maybe you don't fit the gender binary as it was assigned to you at birth, but what does it mean to you to have these different identities and monikers that people use and identify as?
For me personally, the term transgender I use because I am not the gender that I was assigned at birth. I'm not the gender that people expected from me for the first 22 years of my life. I am I'm I have I've I am I have transitioned, and we can go over what that means and what that entails later. And I'm in the process of transitioning, and be that transitional period, that transitional idea makes it to where I am transgender. I know there are some non-binary people who do not choose to use the term transgender, but for me, that term and that's personal. That's personal choice. But transgender just means that you have transitioned from the gender you were assigned at birth. And for non-binary, it's a really important identity to me. Actually, it means a lot to me because not only is it a rejection of the binary, of the idea of a gender binary and how people have to fit in the binary, but also it's the idea of decolonizing my gender. I know that we've mentioned this before about how a lot of the strict ideas of the strict heteronormative and cisnormative ideas come from colonization. There are many, many toxic ideas that came from colonization. This act of one culture going to another culture and taking over their area and taking over their culture, trying to take the aspects of their culture that they wanted while rejecting their history and everything else that comes with it. It's a very destructive process that has gone through and decimated so many different cultures, and art has now left us with a society that doesn't accept diversity as it should. And so being non-binary for me is not only the idea that I don't fit, like the name suggests, into the accepted gender binary, but it's also a rejection of the idea that the gender binary has to exist. It's a rejection of the colonization of all these cultures that I came from, and I was not allowed to connect with. I'm still it's hard for me to connect with because they have been erased so thoroughly, and that erasure is still happening today for other cultures. And I do everything in my power to fight against that and to take a stand against that. And being non-binary is not only my own personal identity, but a part of that stance that um, we should reject the colonization that has been forced upon us and our society. And being gender non-conforming just kind of goes along with that, especially gender non-conforming. You're not conforming with the accepted standards of any gender, and I tend to be non-conformative with everything that I do. Most especially my gender identity, just in being non-binary, but also in my gender presentation, I tend to present, whether I'm being masc or femme, it's not in the expected way of being masc or femme, like masculine or feminine presenting. Even being non androgynous, I tend to lean one way or another, play around with it. I don't like conformity. I find conformity boring, to be honest. So being, again, gender non-conforming is just kind of a part of my presentation and everything that I do in life. I hope that
Absolutely.
tangent was descriptive enough.
Yes, it was. And it honestly made me a little bit introspective in thinking about what non-binary means to me. And
Mhm.
for me, and keep in mind, Ray and I and Ryan, we all have our own experience with these terms and what they mean to us. And I hope that what we say resonates. But if not, there's a ton of other experiences, and I would love to hear about yours personally. So please send us an email if you would like to share. But for me, being non-binary means that I remove myself completely from the idea of gender. I don't see myself as masculine. I don't see myself as feminine, and I never really have. It's why it's been so weird for me to navigate being assigned female at birth throughout the rest of my life because nothing ever quite fit. I was the kid who was wearing a dress and hiking boots and playing with my Hot Wheels and my Barbies outside in a mud pit that I created because that to me that was play, that was normal to me, and that's how I view everything in my life. It's all a mishmash. I am feminine in some ways and I'm masculine in other, but I don't really present either way. I'm definitely perceived as female, and that is because I don't plan on physically transitioning, and that is a very personal topic for people that are transgender. There's a whole
Mhm.
spectrum of people that transition and don't, no matter how they choose to identify or what pronouns they choose to use after they come out of their gender closet, so to speak. Um, and it's a really wide presentation. And the thing that I really want to make a point of here, because I've had a lot of conversations with my own friends and family members sometimes about this, being non-binary is an umbrella term and it lands under this transgender identity. But that doesn't mean that everyone, as Ray mentioned, that is non-binary identifies as transgender. And there's also a little bit of friction sometimes with people who do identify as non-binary and trans not being seen as trans, because not everyone that is non-binary is going to surgically transition or completely transition from the gender assigned at birth to a different gender. And so it's really important to remember that, just like anything else we talk about within this community, there's a spectrum and there's a really wide variety of what these terms mean individually to people. And you're never going to know everybody's idea of what those terms mean. And so staying curious and respectful is just the best way to go about it.
Mhm.
It's really important that you respect that. Like Ray said, not everybody that identifies as non-binary uses the term trans. I do identify as transgender, and I have to explain to a lot of people why I use that term and what it means to me. And like Ray said, it's just that I identify as a gender that is not one that I was assigned at birth. I was not born under the gender I identify as. And so for me,
Mhm.
that means in my mind that I am transgender. And that's a newer
Mhm.
concept for people, even those
Mhm.
who are, you know, even those who consider themselves allies to the trans community. I have definitely had some awkward conversations trying to explain why, yes, I am transgender. Yes, my pronouns matter just as much as anyone who transitions from he to she or she to he. In my mind, there's no difference. And I've had some interactions where I've had to explain to people why my identity is valid. And so I just, kind of speaking from my own soapbox, just want to reiterate that how someone chooses to identify is valid and you don't have to understand it, but you should be respectful of it. If
Mhm.
nothing else, it doesn't change anything about that person. It's just how they want to be addressed and viewed. And it is okay if that is a little foggy to you at first,
Mhm.
as long as you're willing to respect that person as a human and try to do better for them or try to understand better. It's okay if it's uncomfortable at first. It definitely takes some time to unlearn the very socialized gender binary that we've been taught is the only and appropriate way to identify. So it is a
Mhm.
learning process for a lot of people. And I try to be respectful of that for the people in my life, because I've only been out and using they, them for a year. And I really have only expected people to openly use it for about the last 6 months or so. So it's definitely a process, but it's something that you
Mhm.
can help your transgender and non-binary friends and family with, just by being willing to listen to their experiences.
Mhm. With that, though, I think that's a really good way to segue into the idea of transitioning and the difference between different sections of transitioning. So, for those of you who don't know, there is in while being transgender, there is we refer to something that most of us go through as transitioning, and there is social transition, and then there is medical transition. Do we want to go over what the difference is between those two and what they mean and why people may choose to do one, the other, or both?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love talking about this. So I have socially transitioned into being non-binary. I don't have plans of medical transition. I am comfortable with myself as I am, and that's not the same for everybody, and there's no correct answer to this. It's very individual, just like pronouns, identity terms. Everything is very specific to the person that you're talking about. So for me, socially transitioning, I realistically dress very similar to the way that I did previously. I act very similarly, but for me the difference is that instead of getting ready for the day and putting on a mask that made me feel female, that made me feel like I fit the stereotype that I was supposed to because I was born into it, dropping that and losing the expectation of I have to wear makeup every day. I have to wear some really nice top into the office every day because I am supposed to look feminine. Those things for me have been the change in social transition. I actually dress up a lot more now and I enjoy wearing makeup because it is a choice and it is something that I enjoy doing, not because I feel like I have to put on a mask to be seen in this way that society tells me that I'm supposed to be seen. And so for me, it felt like dropping a mask. Instead of pretending that I was a straight female, I now am just me. And I don't have to put on a gender presentation for the world. If I feel like wearing a dress and high heels and makeup, I do. If I feel like wearing baggy sweatpants and a tank top and walking around in my flip-flops at the store, I do that too. And it doesn't matter to me how my gender is perceived because I am comfortable in the way that I present myself now. And so for me, social
Mm-hmm.
transitioning was finding how I navigate the world and feel comfortable in who I am.
I love that. I love that so much. I know I love talking to people about this too. So because it means a lot to me to see people be able to transition because it's kind of like seeing people come home. It's kind of like seeing that person instead of like I mentioned earlier, being shoved into that puzzle piece, being shoved into a place that it's not supposed to go. It's like watching the puzzle piece go into exactly where it's supposed to go. It's that satisfaction of that click of seeing everything come together. Because the idea of social transitioning are things like maybe changing your name if you're choosing to, updating your pronouns if you're changing your pronouns, coming out, and then doing your gender, like having your gender presentation be what you're comfortable with. So there could be very subtle changes, like Shelby was saying, or there could be some very drastic changes, like with if someone always wore very masculine, like perceived as clothes that were perceived as very masculine, they may start wearing clothes that are perceived as more feminine. And they may change their pronouns, they may change their name, like all sorts of things. So personally, I socially transitioned about year and a half ago now. I think about a year and a half ago. I've known that I was trans non-binary for about 2.5, 3 years, and I started socially transitioning about a year and a half ago. I came out, I changed my name, I changed my pronouns, and I started playing around with the way I wanted to present, and I started finding what I was comfortable with. And then I started doing a lot of inner work on deciding if I wanted to medically transition. Medical transition is a term that covers things like people who take hormones, people who get a surgery of any kind, feminizing, masculinizing surgeries. There are terms that are like top surgery, whether that be a breast augmentation or whether that be a double mastectomy with a flat closure. There are a lot of different terms that go into it. A lot of different hormones someone can choose to take, a lot of different ways for them to take those hormones, and a lot of different surgeries someone may or may not choose to have. Personally, I'm currently not on hormones and I don't plan to get on hormones as it stands right now. And but I did choose to get top surgery. And so, very exciting news for me is about 2 months ago, I got top surgery and I got the official medical term is a double mastectomy with a flat closure. And I am much more comfortable in my body. There were a lot of deciding factors in it. I was never comfortable with my chest. I didn't like it from the day I started getting it. It was inconvenient and it made me very uncomfortable with my body. And it made me very uncomfortable with the way that people perceived my body. And I looked in the mirror and it didn't look like me was the thing. A comment that I get a lot that I got when I was planning out when I was like coming up on my top surgery is that people made a lot of assumptions that I was doing it because I thought that my body was unattractive. They were thinking that I was getting top surgery because I found my body unattractive. And that is actually something that I never really struggled with. I knew that other people found my body attractive. I knew that I knew that I fell into expected social norms of what an attractive feminine body should look like. However, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't feel like it was representative of who I was. And I felt like it was my own body was a costume. I felt like my own body was a mask that I was fighting every day to remove. And so the easy solution to that, because a lot of that centered around my chest, which led to me having a very, very feminine, looking body, a body that fit the expected social norms of what a feminine body looks like. And so I chose to get top surgery, and it's been about 2 months. I'm recovering well, and I have never been happier or more comfortable in my body. I move more comfortably. I look in the mirror, and not only like what I see, but I also see myself, and I'm also more comfortable presenting the way I want to present because I am myself, and I am comfortable playing around with gender presentation without feeling like I'm putting on a mask, like I'm shellacking a mask on my face so that you no longer see Ray. You see the character that I'm putting forth. Now, when you see me, you're seeing Ray, and it's a really nice feeling to have.
I think that that is a really important concept. And honestly, I think it segues perfectly into another topic that I wanted to cover. So I am just going to share a little bit about my own experience with the same thing, and then it'll lead right into my next question perfectly for you, Ray. I
Please.
had a very similar experience. My whole life, I never liked who I saw in the mirror. And it wasn't a self-esteem issue. I could look at myself and go, okay, there's a person there, and this person attracts other people. This person is like, I could see everything that I was supposed to about myself, but there was a huge disconnect in seeing that person in the mirror as myself. And it was like living an out of body experience looking into the mirror. I didn't recognize myself. I didn't feel like I was standing in that body that I could see. It was like looking at someone else, and it was very uncomfortable. And for a long time, I didn't like looking in the mirror because of that. I
Mm-hmm.
never felt like I connected with who I saw. And there was never a time that that was more apparent than when I was putting on that mask, like Ray was talking about, when I would wear makeup and dress up. It felt like I was trying very hard to show the world the presentation that I was supposed to be recognized the way that I wanted to. And what that created was a huge dysphoria for me and a huge
Mm-hmm.
disconnect. I didn't have self-esteem issues as in the fact that I thought that I was unattractive or that nobody liked me. I had self-esteem issues because I didn't know who I was and I didn't like who I saw. And coming out of, as I mentioned before, my gender closet and accepting the fact that I'm not a female and I'm not a male, and I don't have to decide. I don't have to choose. I can just exist as I am right now and be myself. That is what being non-binary meant for me. It gave
Mm-hmm.
me the power to just allow myself to exist as I am and see myself as I am. And I have never been more comfortable or confident in who I am as a person, in how I look, in my dating life. It's so interesting how once you start accepting those things, everything else starts to become easier to accept. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that one of the big differences between those who identify as gender nonconforming, non-binary, or transgender compared to our cis friends and allies and community members is that you don't know what that is like, and so you don't ever have to experience that. But dysphoria can happen in so many different ways. So my question for you, Ray, is
Mm-hmm.
what is gender and body dysphoria?
I actually love this question. I know this is a question that a lot of people are really uncomfortable answering because it can be a very sensitive topic, but I think it's important to acknowledge, and I think it's important to explain it for people who might not experience it. And people experience it in a lot of different ways. So if the way I end up explaining it is not how you experience dysphoria, then that doesn't mean that you're not dysphoric, and it doesn't mean that your feelings are invalid. It just means that you experience it differently, and everyone experiences everything a little bit differently, so that's okay. Again, always ask people their own personal experiences. But the way I like to describe gender and body dysphoria is a disconnect and something that doesn't fit in a way that it's just uncomfortable, and that discomfort ends up becoming like a daily thing. And the way I like to describe this to people who maybe have not had these feelings is when it comes to, say, gender dysphoria. A lot of gender dysphoria comes from the way people perceive you and the terms people use for you. And it's a discomfort and a disconnect when these expectations and these terms are used on you and for you. And it ends up becoming a very uncomfortable experience, especially because it generally happens when everyone around you, is trying to put these terms and these expectations on you. And so it's not just like the occasional person using a term that doesn't fit for you, an uncomfortable term. It's like the term that comes to mind is always death by a thousand cuts. Like if it happened only once, if that expectation was put on you only once, it wouldn't be as big of a deal, but it's a consistent issue, and that makes it a larger problem. And the same thing with terms. And I know I've talked to a lot of cis people who are like, well, why is it that big of a deal? And again, the death by a thousand cuts thing, but the thing is that even if you've always used the pronouns that were assigned to you at birth, and you've always been comfortable with the expectations and the idea of your gender that were put on you since birth, even if you're always comfortable with that, I'm pretty sure every person on this planet, has a term or a name or a presentation like an outfit or an expectation that they're not comfortable being put on them, even if it doesn't have to do with gender. Like, for example, I have a brother, his name is Nicholas. This is an example I use a lot. He knows I use it. I've gotten his permission. I have a brother named Nicholas. He has always gone by Nicholas. If someone tries to call him Nick, he gets very uncomfortable and very upset. And he will look at you and he'll say, my name is not Nick. My name is Nicholas. Please refer to me as Nicholas. Because the name Nick did not fit for him. It was not a comfortable fit for him. And so if people use Nick for him, they were using the wrong name, and that's not a comfortable experience. And then when he asked them to not use that name and they continued to, it just made him more uncomfortable, and it was a blatant disrespect of his own wishes. And so that created this long time issue. Same thing with my mom. This is a term that I actually used back. This is a story, that I used to explain back to her this idea, because my mom has had some difficulty with this. My mom has always introduced herself to children by saying, my name is Beth. If you insist, you can call me Miss Beth, but do not call me Mrs. because that's my mother-in-law. Do not call me Mrs. because that term makes her uncomfortable. It sounds like you're calling someone who is not her. And so when people referred to her as Mrs., she became extremely uncomfortable, and she corrected them. And it's a very similar thing when it comes to gender dysphoria or dysphoria with certain terms. It's just a term that doesn't work for you. It's a term that doesn't fit for you, and you're not comfortable being used around you. And the same thing with gender presentation. If you are, if you're a very traditionally masculine presenting person, and someone forces you to dress up in a skirt or a dress, and you do not perceive that as something that is masculine, that represents your identity, that might make you extremely uncomfortable to be forced into that presentation that does not represent you as you truly are. And then as for body dysphoria, it's very similar, but instead of a term or an expectation that is being put on you, it is a body. It is a part of your body. or your body in general. It is your very body feels disconnected from who you are, from yourself. It can be very a very damaging experience to feel so very separated from your body because your body does not feel like yourself. Like I said, it's one of those things that, like, if it was just again, if it was just one drop, it would be fine, but it's a constant irritating thing that creates a dissonance in your entire life.
Yeah. I think that it's important to acknowledge that even cisgendered folks who never transition and always identify as that gender can experience body dysphoria. And for me, from my perspective, body dysphoria is not something that I have experienced as a transgender person, but gender dysphoria is. And so
Mhm.
it's really important to understand that you can experience one or both or neither, and none of that means that you are transgender or cis. Having gender dysphoria doesn't necessarily mean that you are transgender. It can, and there's a lot of reasons for it. There's a lot of trauma responses that could be triggering that type of disconnect with yourself. There's so many reasons for it. And so even though, as we are discussing this from the perspective of the transgender community, keep in mind that these terms and experiences are not limited to those who are transgender. This is something that anyone can experience. And by talking about it and by creating this dialogue, I think that we'll find that a lot of people start to understand these experiences a little more. It's not limited to one particular identity. Anyone can experience these. And the more we talk about it, I think the more that people will start to realize that they may have experienced some of these things in their own life too, even if they never transition or never want to.
I love that you brought that up because it's something that's so important. That's one of the reasons why I love describing it in such a way, because I've spoken about this with groups of people, with groups of cisgender people. Inevitably, I always have at least one person pipe up and be like, "Yes, I had this nickname as a kid and I hated it and it just didn't feel like me and everyone insisted on using it and it just made me so uncomfortable." And I'm like, "There you go. There you go. It's something that anyone can experience." But it's also something that you don't have to experience to be transgender. Though on that topic, I feel like I know we got several questions about this idea of how do you decide on terms and what are terms and what are some gender neutral terms for our non-binary, you know, our non-binary nibblings, which would be like aunts and uncles, non-binary parents. Um, what are some gender neutral terms that you can find, and also how do you find what terms are comfortable for you?
I love this topic so much. It is something that I have been exploring a lot. I personally don't have children of my own, and I don't plan on it, but I do have many nibblings from friends that I'm very close to and from my own siblings. So I love that you brought this up, Ray. Nibbling, as Ray mentioned, this is a term that would replace niece or nephew. That's the child of your sibling, essentially. And I love it so much. It's such an adorable little term, and all of my nibblings use it. It makes me so happy. It's one of my favorites. So I have always been Aunt Shelby to a lot of people, and when I did socially transition, one of my friends came to me and said, "Okay, how do my kids address you now?" And in my mind, I was like, "Well, I'm Aunt Shelby. Like that hasn't changed. This is still who I am. I'm very much still aunt or auntie. Like every child in my life basically calls me that." And then I started to think about it and I was like, well, I mean, what are some other terms that would work? And for aunt, I love the replacement of ent, E-N-T. It can be used across the board. It's very similar. I love it so much. And there's so many different ways that you can refer to people. I know that it can be a struggle to come up with these different terms that meet others. Ray, what are some of the familial terms or terms that you use with your friends when they ask you what you would like to be referred to as?
I have recently started using int. I have a single niece is all of the like official nibblings that I have, but I have many friends who have kids who, a couple of them call me Ray Ray, which is cute. I'm fine with that. I am fine with Aunt Ray. That's fine. I'm also fine with kids just calling me Ray. Like I'm not that hung up on it. But I know a lot of other people who, I mean, people use all sorts of terms that they come up, they'll mix different gendered terms. So you'll see a lot of things, but the one that I use personally is ent. And then I actually do plan on having kids. I don't currently have any children of my own, but I do plan on having kids at some point. And I've thought a lot about what I would want them to call me. And I think I'm just going to be Mama Ray because whereas it's one of those things that for me, how I find whether or not a term fits me is I use it for myself or I have someone else use it for me. And then I see if I get that kind of that uncomfortable feeling where I get like it causes discomfort from someone to use that term for me. And if it causes me discomfort, I'm like, we're not going to use that term anymore. That's not here. And so that's how I found out that I don't like being referred to as dad. I don't think I have dad energy, as I would say. I think I have, and I don't think I have mother energy or mom energy. I think I have mama energy. And therefore, I'm comfortable with being referred to as Mama Ray. So I think when I have kids, I will be referred to as Mama Ray. When I have two platonic life partners who we plan on raising our children together, and I'm probably going to be Mama Ray to all of them. Honestly, if anyone who wants to call me Mama Ray, I'm fine. That's I'm down for. And I know, and I've had people who that cause some confusion because they're like, well, isn't that a very feminine term? And I'm like, it doesn't have to be. It's it's there's the expectation that it's feminine, but it doesn't mean that it has to be. And also, just because I'm non-binary, just because I'm decolonizing my gender, doesn't mean I'm not feminine sometimes. Doesn't mean I don't have feminine aspects in my life. There's nothing wrong with being feminine. There's nothing wrong with being masculine. And just because I'm not beholden to one or the other doesn't mean I'm not one or the other sometimes. And so, yeah, the terms that I prefer are Mama Ray and Int Ray, ENT, like Shelby said. But honestly, you hear non-binary people coming up with new terms for the English language every day for what works for them. I hear Momo a lot. I hear Baba a lot. I hear Mimi is a common one. There are just so many different terms. And then the fun thing that I like about kids is that whatever term you use for yourself, they will find normal. So kids are some of the most accepting people because they're still learning the world. So whatever you show them is normal, they will accept as normal. So whatever term you want your child or your nibbling to use for you, they can. It can be very, and even if you've used a different term, if they're young enough, it's going to be an easy transition for them. Because kids' brains are very malleable. They're sponge-like in the way that they're absorbing information and learning every day. And so they can make those changes at a faster pace than adults.
It is just like when, you are explaining a homosexual couple to a young child and they say, well, why is Uncle David not, with like a woman or whatever situation. Then you explain, oh well, Uncle David loves Uncle Jeff and they're married just like mom and dad would be. Usually that kid will go, oh okay, and then run off and play because that's all they need is just that quick confirmation. And it's true, kids are very adaptable and they're very malleable. It's actually one of my favorite things. I have had so many wonderful experiences with my nibblings. There's one in particular. She is the oldest of my nibblings, and one of the times that I came over, her mom was talking to her about how I was coming over and they were using my pronouns properly and saying they, them. And she kind of stopped and asked her mom, she was like, wait, who's coming over with Auntie Shelby? And her mom just stopped and she was like, nobody's coming over with Auntie Shelby. That's how we talk about Auntie Shelby, is we use they, them. And she kind of stopped and she had this puzzled look on her face. And she was like when someone forgets their backpack and we don't know whose backpack it is. And her mom was like, yep, that's it. We just use they, them for Aunt Shelby because they don't like using gendered terms. And that was the last time that there was ever a question from my oldest nibbling about it. And it's actually my favorite thing because I have heard her when my friends inevitably slip up and use the wrong term, it happens occasionally. She's always the first person to say, "Excuse me, that is not Aunt Shelby's term," and it is my favorite thing ever. She's so quick to just be like, "No, no, we use they them for Aunt Shelby." Yeah,
Love that.
she's precious. She's such a precious little bean.
One of my favorite stories about my siblings, because I don't know if I mentioned this in the last podcast episode, but I have 9 siblings, and 4 of them still live at home. One of them is a 7-year-old girl. She is adorable, and I love her to death, and her name is Tara. Right after I came out to my family and I let them know that I was going by Ray, that my name is Ray, I'm using they, them pronouns, all of this. The first time I went over to my parents' house to visit my siblings after I was socially transitioning. My little sister, who's like, again, I think she was 6 at this point, she was 5 or 6 at this point, she came running out from the front door and she just runs over to me and goes, "Ray!" Jumps up and gives me the biggest hug. And I pick her up and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, hi baby," like all of that. And then this little firecracker of a little girl looks at me and goes, "The boys are I've she has 3 older brothers who still live at home." And so she refers to them as the boys. She's like, "The boys were talking about you and they used your dead name." And I was like, "Oh, did they? That's okay. I mean, they're still learning." And she goes, "It's okay because I looked at them and I said, 'Don't you mean Ray?'" And like ever since that, she is just the biggest little supporter where if she hears anyone try to dead name me, she's like, "Their name is Ray." And I
That
love
is
it.
amazing.
I love it.
I love how adaptable children are, and they don't see the world in that gender binary unless we teach them that that's how it's supposed to be. And those socialized norms are really hard to break. And there's nothing wrong with being socialized as a particular gender if that's how you identify, but when you don't identify that way, it can be really challenging to navigate the world. And so I think it's really important that as we're moving forward, that people understand that talking about wanting to include more gender neutral terms, at least from my perspective, I don't want to erase the gender binary. I don't think that anyone that I know that is non-binary or transgender or non-conforming wants that for anybody, because the entire idea is that that binary being forced on us, or the not even the binary, but the wrong gender being forced on us, is such a disconnect from that. And so it's really important that people understand that it's an inclusive thing. And I know that most people understand that, but I have seen some pushback from people who maybe it's intentional, maybe it truly is just the way that they see the world, that's trying to be erased, and that's not it at all. But there is room to expand those terms and the language that we use to refer to people that we love and help them feel included. um, there's tons and tons of terms that we can go over and talk about, but there are some that really stand out to me that I love, that may be helpful for anyone listening that isn't sure how to refer to their family members. So I do have some terms that I wanted to review, but would love to hear any other input that you have on this topic, particularly, Ray.
No, please do. I love hearing new terms, and I love seeing what terms people have found that fit for themselves.
Okay, so some of the ones that I found that I absolutely love, we talked about nibbling, which would be a gender neutral term for a niece or nephew. The opposite of that would be your pibbling. Your pibbling would be like your aunt or uncle, just a general term that you would refer to a parent or sibling. It's like a mashup of that. So I love that. I think it's adorable to be referred to as a pibbling. A few others that I really like. I love the term grandy for grandma or grandpa, using that in replace.
Mhm.
I think that's a topic that doesn't come up very often, just because generationally speaking, there's probably not a lot of people who, at least for my generation, that would be our grandparents, that maybe gender neutral or transitioned outside of that. But I love the term grandy, and I hope that we get to see it more because
Mhm.
it's adorable. Um, I also
I
I,
love Grandy.
Yes. And also it for nibbling. Some people aren't a fan of nibbling. Sib kid is also another one, like your sibling's kid. That one I've heard that I love that one as well. Kiddo is a pretty gender neutral term that I feel like we use in general in a lot of different areas. But even outside of that, I love the idea of like for partners or people that you're dating. Of course, partner is a gender neutral term that is used very frequently in the polyamorous community, which I do identify as polyamorous. But I also love the term date mate. Date mate is typically referred to as someone who is maybe a newer person that you're dating, not a serious. Partner can be used in a lot of ways. Some people use it across the board for, very, very casual, light dating interactions to life partners. But I love that there's a few different options there, and there's a lot of different ones. One that I've heard recently that actually came from Star Trek for a romantic partner is Imzadi, and I just think that it is it roughly translates to beloved from the Star Trek universe, and
I
I
love
just love
it.
that so much because you could use that term affectionately for anyone in your family. I mean, beloved does not have to be specific to a romantic or sexual partner.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of really wonderful terms out there, but when in doubt, just like everything else, ask. It's always appropriate to ask how someone wants to be addressed, especially if that is someone that you care about and want to have represented in the language that you use. One last term that I found that I also really enjoy. There's a lot of different things that people who are parents may use. I know many non-binary people that still use mom and dad, maybe because their children already use those terms and it was easier for them to continue that. But Moddy, Moddy, is a really cute one that I
Mm.
that I love. But all of these are just specific to the people that you are talking to. It's no different than pronouns or identities. So be open and be willing to ask, because that is really how we are going to make sure that everybody feels included in the language that we use when we're talking to them and about them.
Mhm. I think that's the most important thing to remember about all of these terms. And all like we're calling this like Pride 101. We're going over some basic things both in this episode and the last episode. And I think the most important thing to recognize when speaking about our community is that it is a very personalized existence. It is a very personalized identities, every single one of these. And this is not just in the queer community. Like it's more obvious in the queer community, but the thing is different terms mean different things for everyone. And so one of the things that I have enjoyed most from accepting my identity and being a part of the queer community is this idea of approaching every interaction with curiosity and openness and being willing to learn from people how they see themselves and how they like to be referred and how they like to be seen, because that's an important universal aspect of life. Everyone has terms they enjoy. Everyone has terms they don't like. Everyone has ways that they want to be perceived, and everyone has ways that they perceive themselves. And so I think just approaching every interaction with an open mind and a willingness to learn and understand that you may not understand and that that's okay. I think that is just like a core part of where we should go with interactions and socialization from here on out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that once again, we've kind of hit a perfect segue into a very related topic that I did want to discuss with you today, um, pronouns and how people want to be addressed. What do you do, and how do you handle when someone does use the wrong language or term or misgenders you, whether intentional or otherwise? How do you handle that, and what does that look like for you?
That is a great question. Also something that I'm working on sometimes because it really, for me, it depends on what environment I'm in. First step is that if someone misgenders someone else, I will always correct. That is something that I do not stand for. And unless for any reason the person who is being misgendered has explained why why it's okay, or why they don't want to make a big deal of it, like if they really don't want to have a fight about it, they don't want to see it bothers them to have it discussed, or whether they're not out of the closet for certain people, to certain people. I'm very understanding of those points, but if anything like that, I will correct people just very quick, very quick. It's like, oh, they use these pronouns. Oh, they use this name. Oh, this is it. Like very quick. Like I'm not super confrontational about it, but I do make sure to correct any misgendering I hear of anyone else, whether that person is in the area or not. That does not matter. They still have people have a right to be referred to as they should, as their identity, whether they're in the room or not.
I think
As
that is, oh, I'm sorry. I
oh no,
just wanted
please.
to interject really quick. I think that this is one of the most important things that you can do to support people in your life that you love that use pronouns that were not assigned to their gender at birth. When you know that someone is being referred to as a term or a name or referenced in a way that is not consistent with the way that they want to be addressed and identified as, when you take it upon yourself to very politely, you don't have to be confrontational, but when you take it upon yourself to say, I think that you meant they them, or I think that you meant this name, it really is a powerful tool because that person doesn't have to be in the room for them to have that spoken up for them, and it's really important. And as someone who has dealt with being misgendered and misidentified, there is nothing more important to me than when I hear someone else stand up for me. So if
Mhm.
there are people in your life that use terms that are outside of the norm, make sure that you are being consistent with them, even if they're not there, because it is
Mhm.
one of the most important things. And I'm sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your very
No, I
important
think
discussion. It's just a topic that is very important to me. And I think it is the best way that you can help those terms and identities become more normalized to the people around you.
Mhm. I'm really glad you brought that up because it is so important, and it is that vital of like probably the first basic most vital step. But how I handle when I'm thinking about how I handle being misgendered myself, it like I said, it really depends on the environment. Because if I'm in an environment where I don't think it will be safe for me to correct someone misgendering me, then I will not do it. Like I won't. I live in Texas, which unfortunately means that there are many places that I have to go about my daily life, that it may turn the situation, whatever situation I'm in, into a very hostile or not safe situation for myself if I take that step to correct people who have misgendered me. It's an unfortunate problem with being in not only a southern and conservative state, but also a state that does open carry. It's an unfortunate side effect, but it is a side effect that I do live with. So I judge the situation and I play it situation to situation on whether or not I correct people. If I'm with people that I'm comfortable with and they misgender me, then again, it's the same thing with correcting people who are correcting people who misgender someone else. It's just a quick, hey, by the way, I use they them pronouns. Hey, I go by Ray. My name is Ray. Um, I had the funniest interaction the other day. I talked to some coworkers who it was my job like 4 years ago, so I wasn't out when I worked with them, and I went and I visited the store that I used to work at, and um, a guy that I used to work with came over and they're like, "Oh my goodness, is that dead name?" Like they use my dead name. And I said, "Yes, but I go by Ray now. Like I don't that's not my name anymore. I use Ray." And they were like, "Oh my goodness, Ray, it's so good to see you." And it was as easy as that. It was the such a positive experience to have it just so quickly accepted and changed and switched right off the bat with no questions. And so like that's how I try to run like correcting people who dead name me or misgender me or anything like that. I only tend to get a little more defensive when it's someone who consistently misgenders me, in which case I just kind of look at them very deadpan and with that older sibling look, and I'm like, I use they them pronouns. My name is
Yeah.
Ray. And I just that's what happens.
I have a very similar take on my own identity and when I am misgendered. I am perceived as female and I know that and I recognize that. So when people who may not know my identity, like strangers or people that I haven't seen for a while, if they misgender me, sometimes I don't correct them. It totally depends on the circumstances and the situation. My perceived safety in that situation is a huge part of it. But more than that, it's the perceived level of confrontation that is going to come from that interaction. If it's a stranger that I'm never going to have an interaction with again, I'm probably not going to correct them, just because you never know how people are going to react. And I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I also don't like to stick around to find out sometimes. So in those situations, I usually just like let it run off like water off a duck's feather. But when people who know me and know my preferences continue to misgender me, that to me is the difference. I am 100% happy to help educate someone who may be unfamiliar with terms. That's actually something that Ray and I do with our employer. We hold pronoun training for the employer that we work with, and I absolutely love being able to be a source of education so that someone else may not have to experience some of the dysphoria that I have by being misgendered. It's one of the things that I love doing. I love being able to help educate and expand people's perspective and the language that they use. So I have no problem doing that for my friends and family. But when it is a continued problem, I am a little bit more confrontational. And I actually had an interaction last year, very early on after I came out, with people that I was very close to. And I still am. I do want to clarify, I am still very close to these people, but it was a very hard situation. These are people in my life who have always been very supportive of the LGBTQ community. Some of them identify in different aspects of that community, and very supportive of our friend's daughter who transitioned very early in their life, socially transitioned very early in their life. And so when I came out as non-binary, I could not have expected what would have happened just based off of who these people are and my experience with them up to that point. I would have never guessed that I would have had to explain why my gender is valid to them. And that was a really difficult conversation. And I didn't handle it as well as I would like to think that I would now. I definitely have a different perspective of people's perceptions and how to help someone understand my identity. But I do also want to point out that if you are a person who experiences misgendering, if you are a person who has continually misgendered someone, I just want to make it known that if it is a situation where you've been expressing how you want to be recognized, or someone has expressed that to you continually, and you do continue to misgender and not put an effort into being respectful and correcting yourself when it happens, because that does happen, and it is okay to stop and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I meant they, or I meant he, whatever situational. I misgender myself, I misgender my trans friends sometimes. The difference is that it's not intentional, and when it happens, I stop and apologize, correct myself, and move on. If you are not willing to do that and someone is upset with you, I want you to understand that that person does not owe you the respect of being polite. If you are putting someone in a position where they feel unsafe, if they feel like you do not respect their identity and you should be a safe person in their life, it is appropriate for them to be upset with you. And I don't want to perpetuate the idea that it is okay to, you know, anger is a really hard thing to navigate, but I just want everyone listening to this podcast to understand that if a trans person has expressed to you how they want to be identified over and over and over again, and you continue to misgender them, it is well within their rights to be upset with you, and they do not owe you any type of polite response. And expecting that is manipulative. And that is one of the experiences that I have had with someone who I was very close to and still am. But it took a while to repair that rocky side of our relationship, because they did continue to misgender me and then get upset with me for my reaction. And I finally just had to explain that, a year later, if you claim to be an LGBTQ ally and a member of that community, and you continue to disrespect someone that you claim to love and be friends with, they don't owe you any type of politeness. And I know that this is a really hard topic, but I view it the same as racism, as sexism, because it is sexism. And any other of these heinous problems that we see in our society, I would get upset about them if someone continually disrespected a community. And I think that trans folks are well within their rights to be upset when they're not respected. And expecting people to be polite in the face of oppression is very manipulative and abusive. And I know that I'm kind of going off on a soapbox, but this is why I have a podcast, so I can express my opinions. And this is one of them. So please respect the trans community. Please do your best to help support them, and understand that if you don't and someone gets upset with you, you don't really have a right to be upset that that's their reaction, especially if they have tried to work with you and you are not respecting them.
Exactly. And I will put this out there. I know we are coming up on the end of our time. I've loved our conversation, but I will put this out there for any of you any trans folks out there who is experiencing that type of relationship. I want to say, and maybe isn't as confrontational or maybe isn't as sure how to handle it. It does not have to be a big blow up scene for you to express to that person that if they continue to disrespect your identity, you're not going to continue to interact with them. Because at the end of the day, it's just about boundaries. You have a boundary that you expect your identity to be respected, your pronouns to be used, and your correct name to be used. This is a very basic boundary that basically everyone has. It's not talked about for cis folks. So it's that you're not asking too much. And if someone is not comfortable doing that, then it can be as easy as saying, okay, I have a boundary that I expect my identity to be respected, and I expect the correct terms to be used, and you have a boundary that you will not do that. That that simply means that as adults, our relationship is not healthy. We will just continue to cause harm to each other, and therefore we should move on without interacting. And it's as easy as that. It's as easy and as difficult as that, I should say. And no one's in the wrong for doing that.
No, they're not. One of the things that I would like to clarify with that, and thank you, Ray, for bringing this up, you don't have to be confrontational to set boundaries, but oftentimes setting boundaries can be seen as confrontational. And so I do want to clarify in the story that I shared that that was what had happened. My boundaries were perceived as confrontational, and then continued to be disrespected. And I just want to clarify that I try my best to keep things as polite as possible, but which you are not owed that.
Yes,
no,
you
no
don't
one
have
is
to do
owed
that.
No, absolutely.
Yes,
And
that
if
is
you are offended by someone's response to the way that you are disrespecting them, but you are not bothered by the disrespect that you are giving that person, that is a bigger issue. And I will always err on the side of, if you are in the wrong and you are upset about somebody's reaction, maybe you need to take a little bit of a deeper look at that. And I know that that's a very simplified way to look at this, but in my personal opinion, and I think most people who are trans, if you are choosing to disrespect someone's identity that you claim to love, you are in the wrong. And I don't care what other argument you have for feeling that way. It comes down to basic human respect and boundaries. And that can be really hard for people to set and really hard for people to understand. We're not a society that is really big on respecting boundaries of each other. And it can be really hard when you are the first person to branch out from the social norms and set those boundaries. So just know that you are not in the wrong for expecting people to respect you, and you do not have to accept that behavior. Even if you're not confrontational, even if you don't have the desire or ability to speak up for yourself in that moment, you do not have to tolerate people that do not respect you. And it is 100% okay to remove yourself from those relationships and situations, and you do not have to feel guilty about doing so. Your identity is important, even if someone else is not willing to acknowledge it.
Exactly. I think that's a great term, that it's a great reminder for people, is that that sum up that you said at the end there. Your identity is not invalid. just because someone else doesn't respect it.
And that goes beyond the trans community. And I think that that is fundamentally why I do get so heated about these discussions, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be seen for who they are. Everybody wants to be respected. Everybody wants to feel validated and seen. And the idea that that is limited to the trans community is a huge disconnect in our society. If I'm just going to go on my preachy little soapbox for 1 second. If we could all separate identities and race and religion and all of these different factors from how we see and treat people, so many of the problems that we deal with in our society would not be as escalated as they are. It really should be as simple as I'm a human, you're a human. We both have this need to feel understood and wanted, and that's all it comes down to. Not every person is going to be your person, and that's okay, but we should all be able to respect and acknowledge each other's right to exist in the way that we feel comfortable.
Exactly. I love that. And I think that's a great way to end the podcast there, because again, we are coming to the end of our time, but I think that's a great summation and a great ending, is that embrace differences, respect differences, just respect people's culture, respect people's identity. It's a very, very basic first step to anything. If you want to be an ally to any community, listen and understand that you may not always understand, but that doesn't make it invalid. Just because you don't
Absolutely.
understand does not mean that what they're experiencing and what they're saying is not true. And that's
Now,
okay.
yeah, absolutely. The only other thing that I want to add here, and then we can definitely end, because I know that we will talk forever. This is why we host a podcast. We like talking. One of the things that is really important for me to identify here in this podcast, we will use the term ally a lot. There are a lot of different meanings and terms, but I think that I speak for Ray and I both. We know each other very well and we work together very well. So I feel confident in saying that when we use the term ally, we are talking about people who are actively participating in supporting other communities. That doesn't have to look like anything specific. It's not a commitment of money or time or anything else. It is the idea that you are either acting to support those communities or you are not. And if you are not actively speaking up and doing things that you can in your own 10 acres of your life, you are not an ally. And if you are an ally, then great. But I want to make sure that people understand that the term ally is thrown around very loosely, and I have a hard time with it, because you can support all kinds of rights, but being an ally is not just supporting those rights. Being an ally is being involved how you can in the abilities that you have. It's not limited to one specific thing, but it is an active participation in supporting those communities. So if you want to be seen as an ally, don't tell people that you're an ally. Do things that make yourself an ally, support the people in your life, and learn how you can, because that is really what an ally is. And this is an important topic to me and something that I have learned more about, that I've been challenged on recently. And so I'd like to challenge everyone listening: if you consider yourself an ally, make sure that you are taking action to be considered that, and don't just say that you are an ally because you support the rights of a community.
For me, my take on allyship is that it's not a self-identified term. It's not a term. Don't call yourself an ally. Let your actions speak. Let your words speak for what they are. And if you are an ally, people will identify you as such. People of that community that you are trying to be an ally for will identify you as such. But with
Yes.
that said, I have loved talking with you, as always, Shelby, as always. And thank you all for listening.
Yes, thank you for joining us today. We always love the opportunity to get on our soapboxes and talk about things that are important to us.